I'm Rick Soper, and this is the 4th episode of the reading series. This time, I'm moving from my novels to my novellas, starting with the Bainbridge Killings. Bainbridge is very different from my other books because it's told from the perspective of one character, FBI agent John Stevens, who needs to go to the island undercover to investigate a series of murders and is met with a world he's very unfamiliar with. This is the Bainbridge Killings. The clouds above John Stevens' head hung over him like fat, smoky cotton balls ready to burst at any moment. But the rain wouldn't come. Instead, the air was thick with moisture that collected on his skin until it beaded and dripped down the sides of his face in lazy streaks. Stevens stood, still and rigid, at the railing, going through the details of the killings he'd come to investigate, as the ferry made its way across Puget Sound, traveling from Seattle to the island of Bainbridge. The local sheriff, Stan Branson, officially called them suicides. Stevens called them killings. Nobody really knew. The facts pointed towards suicide, but the details were too similar, even if the connections were non-existent. If it was as simple as suicide, John Stevens wouldn't be there. If things made sense, if there was a direction for the investigation to go, a suspicion to be followed up on, they wouldn't have called him in. Nobody called in John Stevens until they were banging their head bloody against a brick wall. Seattle's concrete high-rise skyline fell away in the distance to his right as he turned to his left and faced the tree-covered island of Bainbridge. They were two completely different worlds. One, an ultra-sleek modern metropolis on the cutting edge. The other, a sleepy green resort destination that seemed to spring out of a simpler era. Bainbridge didn't look like the kind of place a serial killer would live. It looked like the kind of place you would run to relax and get away from the hustle and bustle of the big cities, the kind of retreat where you could escape all of your troubles. A woman walked out onto the top deck from inside the ferry, breaking his solitude. It was 2 p.m, and most of the few people on the ferry were sitting comfortably inside, watching their journey through ferry windows, getting a bite to eat at the restaurants, or standing next to their cars below deck. The woman had a long, tan overcoat similar to what Stevens was wearing, except she wore it over a dress and high, black heels. Her long brown hair framed her thin, sculpted face and fell in blonde-tinted curls over her shoulders. She turned to look at Stevens, and as their eyes met, he saw in hers surprise and dismay, maybe even fear, as she turned and walked quickly back inside. He wasn't unattractive, just unavailable. His mind was on his job. He tried not to think about the look in her eyes. Was it that obvious? The things he'd seen, the cases he'd worked, what he'd been forced to do, had wormed its way into every part of who he was. People could see the darkness. That's why they avoided him. But it was more than that. Other things, fluttering at the edge of his brain, made him want to avoid being still long enough to attract attention. Stevens looked down as the ferry docked. Men moved back and forth, securing lines, dropping plates into place for cars, and after a few minutes, people started to disembark. The tourists took pictures. The residents drifted off in the direction of their cars or their homes. The workers trudged slowly, begrudgingly, towards their jobs. When the majority had made their way off the ferry, he walked down the stairs to where his rented Mercedes was parked and followed the ferry workers out. He drove away from the dock up to the main road, made a left, and drove leisurely through the village. Charming little shops, galleries, and restaurants lined the sides of the streets, filled with people who looked relaxed and happy, as if their lives had a pace to them that was much slower than the cities Stevens was used to working in. Stevens had been raised in Washington, D.C., a city that moved like thunder. Purpose in every step, everyone focused tightly on their destination. The crimes that Stevens usually investigated happened in metropolitan areas that were very similar to his D.C. home. Only the biggest populations produced the solitary, infected minds that created the horrific world that he lived in. He had little experience with the overwhelming beauty of nature, and the scene that opened up as he headed out of the village stunned him. The concrete jungle of Seattle receded as he drove down the tree-covered roads towards his destination in the center of the island. His lungs felt overfilled with oxygen and the scent of the forest. The pure air, replacing the congestion and grime that coated his day-to-day life, made his head spin. By the time he hit his turn, Stevens was deep in the deep country, surrounded by soaring pine trees, rolling green hills, and hidden houses. He'd gotten the directions beforehand, but as he turned down the lonely dirt road, he wondered if he'd gotten them wrong. Then he wound his way around a bend, and the forest opened up to the valley that was home to Holly's Folly Bed and Breakfast. Stevens had picked the spot because of its central location and because it advertised itself as being isolated from the rest of the world. But the pictures on the website didn't do it justice. Not by a long shot. Nestled in the valley, surrounded by trees, the main building sat just above a sea of flowers that dropped down into a duck-covered pond, past which there were rows of farm vegetables, chicken coops, and a grove of grazing sheep and a pasture filled with horses. The city boy in him wondered how people could live like this, while the rest of him wondered why anyone would ever check out. He drove his car up to the side of the main building. As he got out, he heard a female voice calling to him from behind, "Mr. Lawrence?" A beautiful woman was walking towards him, brushing the dirt off one hand against her jeans, the other carrying a potted plant. She wore a flowered shirt and a wide-brimmed straw hat that sat at an angle on her head. As she came up to him, she smiled, her eyes glittering with interest rather than fear, as he laughed nervously, struggling to remember his cover. "John Lawrence, yes. Are you Miss Holly?" She gripped his large hand with surprising strength as she continued to look into his eyes. "Actually," she said, "it's Miss Falter, but please call me Holly." "It's nice to meet you, Holly." He gestured at the sea of flowers. "This is an amazing place you have here." She smiled knowingly. "Like the sign says, it's my folly, my labor of love. And that will someday be the death of me." Her sincerity was infectious and her lack of fear surprising. "Well," he said haltingly, "it shows." She looked at him thoughtfully for a moment and then shrugged. "Well, thank you. Now let's get you checked in." Inside, she took his information, grabbed his key, and smiled at him again. "So what brings you to our island?" "Shopping." She paused. "Mr. Lawrence," she said, laughing softly, "you don't look like the shopping type." Stevens laughed, trying to hide his shock and surprise at both her perception and willingness to express it. "Well, yes, you have me there. I'm not looking for knickknacks or anything like that. Maybe a house." "Oh, so you're looking to join our happy little community here on the island?" She grinned at him slyly, her face barely concealing her interest. "It would be a happy retreat from Houston," he said, forcing his eyes away from her face and towards the door. "It would." He felt her eyes on him again. Then she nodded, turned away, finished his registration, and then led him out towards the cabin in the forest, where he stood for a moment, listening as his eyes scanned the silent wood. "I don't see anybody else around," he said. She grinned. "It's off season, so right now it's just you and me." Not waiting for a reply, she gave him a sidelong glance and walked away. He watched her uneasily, trying to decide if the slow swing of her hips was natural or a show she was putting on just for him. And that's how the Bainbridge Killings starts. It's really a fun novella, and I hope you check it out. I'm Rick Soper, and thank you for watching.